The afternoon sun blazes over the naval base gym. Inside, the air is thick with the scent of iron and sweat. Groups of Navy SEALs are pushing their limits, the sound of heavy plates clanging, echoing off the concrete walls. A woman walks in. She wears plain, black athletic gear with no unit patches, no flashy logos. One SEAL pauses his lift, a smirk playing on his lips. "Wrong place, sweetheart," he mocks. A few others chuckle. She doesn't say a word. She just sets her bag down. As her sleeve shifts, a flash of ink catches the light. A commanding officer enters. He sees ink. Elena Cross was 30 years old, but her eyes held a weight that suggested she had lived twice that long. She walked into the base gym with a quiet, measured stride that seemed out of sync with the aggressive atmosphere of the room. To the casual observer, she was just an outsider, someone who had wandered onto the restricted part of the base by mistake. In a place like this, where every man was a literal mountain of muscle and every woman carried a clear rank or a sharp attitude, Elena was a complete anomaly. She was fit but not bulky. She was focused but not aggressive. She carried herself with a stillness that was almost unsettling to those used to the loud, clashing egos of special operations. The gym was the absolute heart of the SEAL community on this base. It was a brotherhood, a fortress where respect was earned through physical dominance, blood, and shared trauma. The air was always charged with high-octane testosterone and the heavy, choking smell of chalk dust. When Elena walked past the squat racks, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The SEALs, men who had seen the absolute worst the world had to offer, judged her in a heartbeat. They didn't see a threat. They didn't see a peer. They saw a sweetheart who had lost her way to the yoga studio, or perhaps the administrative offices down the road. Jax, a Tier 1 operator with a reputation for being as loud as he was strong, was the first to speak. Jax was a man who lived for the challenge, his body covered in scars from deployments in the Hindu Kush and the jungles of the Amazon. He dropped a heavy barbell, the sound ringing through the room like a gunshot. He wiped his brow with a greasy towel and looked Elena up and down, his eyes scanning for any sign of military discipline or recognized insignia. "Wrong place, sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping with a toxic mix of amusement and arrogance. "The civilian visitor center is 2 blocks back. This playground is for the big dogs. You might want to find somewhere with lighter weights before you hurt those delicate hands of yours." A few of his teammates chuckled, leaning against their machines to watch the show. It wasn't malicious in a traditional sense, not exactly, but it was utterly dismissive. It was the kind of comment made by someone who thinks they know exactly where everyone fits in the natural hierarchy of the world. They looked at her plain clothes, her lack of any unit insignia, and her quiet demeanor and decided she simply didn't belong in their temple of iron. To them, she was a tourist in a land of warriors. Elena didn't flinch. She didn't even look at Jax directly. She didn't need to. She had spent her entire life in rooms filled with men exactly like him. Men who mistakenly thought volume equaled value and that muscle mass defined a person's spirit. She found an empty corner near the pull-up bars and began her warm-up. Her movements were perfectly economical. No wasted energy. No preening for the mirrors. She ignored the stares and the hushed, mocking whispers that followed her every move. She had spent years in environments much more hostile than a high-tech naval gym. She had walked through the dust-choked markets of Kabul and stood on the slippery decks of sinking ships in the middle of a storm. She knew that words were the cheapest form of currency and that silence was often the most powerful weapon in an operative's arsenal. To her, Jax was just white noise, a minor distraction she had learned to tune out a long time ago in the field. She knew that in a place like this, the only way to silence the noise was to simply ignore it. She was here for a primary reason, and it had absolutely nothing to do with earning the approval of men who thought a plain black shirt meant a plain, uninteresting past. As she stretched, she felt the familiar, comforting pull of her muscles. It was a reminder of the thousands of hours she had spent preparing her body for the unthinkable. She was a ghost in their house, and for now she was perfectly fine with remaining invisible. The SEALs eventually went back to their heavy lifts, but their eyes kept drifting back to her against their will. There was something about her posture, the way she kept her back perfectly straight, the way she moved with the silent grace of a panther stalking prey. There was a confidence that didn't come from a fragile ego, but from a deep-rooted, terrifyingly quiet competence. But in their eyes, she was still just an intruder, a woman in the wrong place at the wrong time, playing at being tough in a room full of the real thing. They had no idea that the real thing had just walked through the door. If you think people are judged too quickly by appearance, comment, "That is unfair." Elena began her routine. It wasn't flashy, and it certainly wasn't loud. She didn't grunt or scream like the men around her. She started with bodyweight movements that required extreme core strength and balance, calisthenics that made the elite operators pause mid-set. She moved from perfect L sets to slow, controlled handstand push-ups. These were the kind of exercises that look incredibly easy until you actually try to perform them with her level of precision. Slowly, the mockery in the room began to fade into a reluctant, silent curiosity. Jax and his team were still lifting heavy, but they were watching her out of the corners of their eyes with a growing, gnawing suspicion. They noticed that her form was clinical, not just good, but absolute. Every rep was identical to the last. Every movement was controlled down to the millimeter. She didn't grunt. She didn't slam the weights. She just worked. There was a rhythmic beauty to her movement that suggested she wasn't just working out. She was practicing a high-level discipline. It was the movement of someone who practiced for survival, not for the aesthetics of a mirror. Jack stepped over to the water fountain, positioned so he could get a better look at her without being too obvious. "Not bad form for a civilian," he muttered to his friend, though the arrogance was finally beginning to leak out of his voice, replaced by a nagging sense that something was fundamentally wrong. He saw her move to the heavy bag. She didn't just hit it, she dismantled its rhythm. Her strikes were precise, aimed at specific targets: the temple, the solar plexus, the liver. She wasn't hitting for power alone. She was hitting for absolute, immediate effect. It was a combative style designed for ending fights, not winning points. Then she moved to a more intense part of her circuit. The gym was heating up, the humidity rising with every breath as 50 men pushed their bodies to the limit. She took off her light outer jacket, revealing a thin, athletic tank top underneath. As she reached up to grab the pull-up bar for a set of explosive muscle-ups, her right sleeve shifted up toward her shoulder. That was when the first real clue appeared. Across her shoulder and down her bicep was a tattoo. It wasn't a standard anchor, a screaming eagle, or even a typical Navy SEAL trident that you'd see on a veteran's arm. It was a complex geometric design interlaced with a specific type of ancient knotwork that seemed to move under her skin as she flexed. To 99% of the world, it was just impressive art. But to the men in this room, who spent their entire lives studying symbols and unit history, it started to look terrifyingly familiar. It was a unit tattoo, but not one from this base. Not one they had ever seen in any official training manual. A few of the older SEALs, men with salt and pepper hair who had seen the dark black ops era of the late 90s, stopped what they were doing entirely. They moved closer, trying to get a better look without being caught staring. The tattoo featured a specific sequence of coordinates hidden in the lines and a small stylized symbol of a broken compass at the center. It was the mark of the black box units, teams that officially didn't exist in any government budget. Teams that handled the operations the SEALs only heard about in whispered, fearful legends over drinks in dark, windowless bars. Jack saw it too. He frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion and a touch of realization. "What is that?" he whispered to his buddy. He knew that kind of ink wasn't something you bought in a parlor in San Diego or Virginia Beach. It was the kind of ink that was tattooed in the back of a moving cargo plane or in a safe house in a country you couldn't even find on a map. It was a badge of entry into a world of shadows, a world where names were erased and ranks were forgotten. Elena noticed the shift in the room immediately. She felt the temperature of the conversation drop several degrees. She felt the eyes burning into her ink like lasers. She knew exactly what they were looking at, and she knew that the silence was replacing the laughter. But she didn't stop. She pushed even harder. She began a series of high-intensity intervals, burpee broad jumps and box jumps that would have left most of the men in the room gasping for air. She was breathing heavy now, but her eyes remained sharp, focused on a point in the distance that only she could see. The sweetheart label was officially dead. Now they were trying to figure out who or what she truly was. They saw the old scars on her knuckles and the way she scanned the room every time a door opened. These were the instinctive traits of a predator, not a guest. The small details were starting to reveal a massive, terrifying truth. She wasn't in the wrong place. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, and they were the ones who were suddenly out of their depth. The gym felt different now, no longer a playground, but a staging area. If you realize small details can reveal big truths, comment, "I was wrong." The heavy double doors of the gym swung open with a resounding bang. Commander Silas Vance stepped in. Silas was a living legend in the naval special warfare community, a man who had survived more impossible missions than most people had birthdays. He had silver hair, a chest full of medals he never wore, and eyes that could cut through steel plates. When Vance walked into a room, the air tightened. Even Jack stood a little straighter, his chest puffing out instinctively in the presence of a superior he actually respected. Vance began his habitual scan of the gym. It was a habit from decades of command, checking the readiness of his troops. He looked at the progress of his teams, noting who was pushing their limits and who was coasting on their past reputation. His eyes swept over the equipment racks, the mats, and finally they landed on the woman in the corner, finishing her final set. He didn't see a sweetheart. He saw a ghost from a war that officially never happened. Silas Vance froze. For the men who worked under him, seeing Vance lose his composure for even a second was like seeing a mountain move. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stared at the ink on Elena's arm as she dropped from the bar, her muscles gleaming with sweat and her breathing controlled. He walked toward her, ignoring everyone else in the room. The seals parted like the Red Sea, their eyes wide with confusion. Jax watched, his heart thudding in his chest like a drum. He had never seen the commander look at anyone, not even visiting admirals or high-ranking politicians, with the kind of expression he was wearing now. It was a mixture of absolute shock, deep-seated grief, and a profound, bone-deep respect that bordered on reverence. Elena dropped from the bar, landing silently on the balls of her feet. She sensed him before she saw him. That sixth sense that only comes from living in high-threat environments where being unaware means being dead. She turned, wiping the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand, her eyes meeting his without a hint of fear. Vance stopped exactly 5 feet away. He didn't offer a salute. This was a gym, and she wasn't in uniform. But his posture was more formal and rigid than if he had been at a change of command ceremony in full-dress whites. He gestured toward the tattoo on her arm. The broken compass. The coordinates that marked a place in the North Atlantic that didn't exist on any commercial map. "Where did you get that?" Vance asked. His voice wasn't the bark of a commander. It was the low, gravelly tone of a man who knew exactly what that mark cost to acquire in terms of blood and sanity. Elena looked him in the eye. She didn't blink. She didn't look for his approval or his permission. "Earned it," she replied. 2 words. That was all. But in the world of special operations, those 2 words are the ultimate currency. You don't get that kind of ink. You don't buy it on a dare. You survive long enough for someone to tell you that you've earned the right to wear the mark of a unit that takes care of the world's darkest problems so the public can sleep in peace. Vance nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the tattoo. He knew exactly what she meant. He had been a young officer during the Operation Nightshade era, the era that tattoo belonged to. He remembered the stories of the Night Ravens, a group of operatives who worked so deep in the black that they were stripped of their names, their ranks, and their pasts. They were the ones who went in when even the SEALs were told the risk was too high for a conventional force. "Sector 7?" Vance asked, his voice almost a whisper, a question that carried the weight of 100 lost souls. "And 9, Elena added quietly, her voice steady and devoid of the trauma she had surely endured. The room went deathly silent. Even Jax, who didn't know the specifics of Sector 7, knew the weight of the silence that followed. He looked at the woman he had mocked, the sweetheart, and felt a cold, crushing wave of shame wash over him. He realized that while he was training for the fight, she had already been through the war that nobody was allowed to talk about. She had seen things that would make a Tier 1 operator wake up in a cold sweat. She had earned that ink in places where there were no backup plans and no satellite coverage to call for help. She had earned it by losing people whose names would never be etched on any memorial or spoken in any public service. She had earned it by being the person who stayed behind in the dark so that others could get home to the light. The realization was like a physical blow to Jax's ego. Vance looked around at his men, his eyes landing on Jax. The commander didn't have to say a single word. The look in his eyes was enough to let Jax know that he had just committed the ultimate sin of a warrior. He had underestimated a peer because of his own narrow-minded, arrogant ego. He had judged a book by its cover, only to find out the book was a manual on how to survive hell and keep going. "It's been a long time since I've seen that compass," Vance said, turning back to Elena, his voice full of a strange, heavy nostalgia. I thought everyone from that unit was gone. I thought the Ravens had finally stopped flying after the last extraction failed." "Most are," Elena said, her voice softening just a fraction for the first time. "I'm just finishing the work they started. Someone has to keep the map straight." The atmosphere in the gym had completely transformed. The air felt heavier, charged with a new kind of electricity that silenced the clanging weights. The SEALs weren't just watching a woman work out anymore. They were standing in the presence of a history they could only dream of understanding. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone. The wrong place wasn't her location. The wrong place was Jax's arrogant, ignorant mouth. She belonged here more than any of them. If you believe real experience doesn't need to be explained, comment, "I am indebted." Commander Vance didn't make a big announcement. He didn't call the room to attention or explain who Elena was to the curious crowd. He knew that for someone like her, a public introduction was a violation of her privacy and her safety. She was a ghost, and ghosts prefer the shadows where they can work in peace without being bothered by the noise of the living. He looked at his men one last time, then back at Elena, acknowledging the unspoken bond between those who have seen the dark side of the moon and returned to tell the tale. "She's cleared," he said simply to the room. That was it. 2 words from the CO that acted like a master key. It didn't just mean she was allowed to be there. It meant she was untouchable. It meant that her presence in this gym was a privilege for the men training alongside her, not the other way around. It was a stamp of absolute legitimacy that silenced every remaining doubt in Jax's mind. Vance turned and walked out, his footsteps echoing in the sudden, heavy silence. Elena didn't pause for a victory lap. She didn't look at Jax to see the look of absolute defeat and humiliation on his face. She didn't need the petty satisfaction of his shame. She had outgrown such things in the field. She just walked back to the heavy bag, her focus returning instantly as if the encounter had never happened. Thud, thud, thud. The sound of her strikes was the only thing that broke the quiet of the gym. Each hit was a rhythmic reminder of why she was here. Jax stood by the water fountain, his head bowed, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped his bottle. He felt the weight of his teammates' glares on his back. They knew he had messed up. They knew he had violated the core tenet of their brotherhood. Respect is a baseline, not a reward based on what someone looks like. He looked at Elena, really looked at her this time. He saw the way she carried her scars like silent medals. He saw the focus in her eyes that only comes from staring death in the face and refusing to blink first. He realized that she wasn't here to prove anything to them. She didn't care about their gym or their big dog status. She was here to maintain the lethal machine that she had become through years of suffering and sacrifice. She was here because this was the only environment that felt normal to someone who had lived in the black for so long. This was her home, more than any quiet civilian street could ever be. Slowly, the rest of the gym began to move again, but it was different now. The clanging of the weights was more subdued, almost respectful. The conversations were quieter, whispered instead of shouted. There was a new sense of humility in the room, a realization that they were in the presence of a true veteran of the shadows, someone who had done the work they were only preparing for. Jax walked over to his station, but he didn't pick up his weights right away. He looked at Elena one more time. He wanted to apologize. He wanted to say something to fix the damage he had done with his arrogant words, but he realized that words wouldn't help a person like her. An apology from him was just more noise she didn't need. It was just another ego trying to feel better about itself at her expense. The only way to show her real respect was to do exactly what she was doing, to work, to be quiet, to earn his place in the room all over again through effort, discipline, and silence. He picked up his barbell and began to lift, his smirk replaced by a grim, determined focus that he hadn't possessed an hour ago. She had taught him more about being a warrior in 5 minutes than a year of training ever had. Elena kept training, like she hadn't just been cleared by a legend, like she hadn't just silenced a room full of the world's most elite warriors. She was a night raven, and the ravens didn't care about the opinions of the birds in the trees. They only cared about the mission. They only cared about being ready for the next time the world went dark and someone needed to go in and turn the lights back on. If you believe respect should come from understanding, not assumptions, comment, "I will live kindly." In the world of the elite, the loudest voice is often the weakest link. We are taught to look for titles, for medals, for the clear signs of authority that the world likes to put on display to impress the masses. We look at a person's clothes, their gender, or their age, and we think we know their entire story before they even open their mouth to speak. But the real legends don't wear their resumes on their sleeves for the world to see. They carry them in their scars, their silence, and their ink. Elena Cross didn't come to that gym to be a hero. She didn't come to put the men in their place or to start a fight with an arrogant operator. She came because her past required her to be ready for a future that most of us will never have to see or even imagine. She didn't need Jax to know who she was. She didn't even need the CO to recognize her tattoo. Her value was already settled long ago in the mud, the cold, and the blood of Sector 9. A tattoo like the broken compass isn't a decoration, it's a burden. It represents the weight of the secrets you have to keep and the people you had to leave behind in order to finish the job that everyone else gave up on. When Elena said she earned it, she wasn't bragging about an achievement. She was acknowledging a cost that most people couldn't pay if they tried. She was talking about the pieces of herself she had left on a foreign soil so that others could live in peace. Respect isn't something you give to people because they are like you or because they fit your narrow image of what a warrior should look like. It's something you give because you realize that everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. Jax learned that lesson the hard way today. He learned that the wrong place isn't a physical location on a map. It's the place found inside your own narrow-minded, judgmental assumptions. Elena finished her workout, packed her bag, and walked out the same way she came in, quietly, invisibly. She didn't look back at the gym to see the changed faces or the respect in their eyes. She didn't wait for a salute or a word of praise from the men who now watched her with silent awe. She just merged back into the world, another face in the crowd, a shadow returning to the shadows where she felt most at home. But in that gym, the legend of the Night Raven lived on. The men there would never forget the woman who silenced them without saying a single word of defense. They would look at every newcomer with a little more curiosity and a lot more respect from that day forward. They would remember that strength doesn't always roar like a lion. Sometimes it just breathes like a panther, because you never know when a sweetheart is actually a ghost. And you never know when a simple tattoo is actually the only map to a war that saved the world, while everyone else was sleeping safely in their beds. Be the person who earns their place, not the person who talks about it. Because in the end, the ink that matters most isn't on your skin. It's written on your character, your discipline, and your quiet actions when no one is watching. If you believe the people who've earned their place don't need to prove it to anyone, leave a comment below. And if this story reminds you that real respect comes from understanding, not assumptions, Don't forget to subscribe for more.